So as we turn our attention now to other news that's made headlines this week, the 2026 State of the Nation address, President Cyril Ramaphosa named organised crime and corruption as major threats to South Africa's democracy and economy, announcing new policing measures, SANDF support and justice reforms. But beyond the speech, what does this all mean for ordinary South Africans facing lawlessness, unemployment and fragile local governance? Today, we're going to be unpacking the legal, the social, the economic implications with lawyer and social activist Nkanyiso Ngqulunga. Nkanyiso, good morning and thank you for your time with us here on the SABC at this hour.
A very good morning to you and good morning to the listeners, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, we're going to get straight into some of the sentiments that have been echoed this week. We're trying to make sense of what's transpired. Let's look at, the Sona 2026, President Ramaphosa naming organised crime, corruption as existential threats to South Africa's democracy, society and economic growth. So we saw the measures announced, military support for police, justice reforms, new enforcement strategies as well. But from a legal, from a social justice perspective, what does this actually mean when the head of state says something like this? What does the Constitution require beyond good intentions? There's some questions about the deployment of troops domestically, what this raises about policing boundaries, civil rights and long-term community trust as well. Break that down for us.
No, thank you very much for that. We are at the time in our country where we've seen a massive decline of state capacity, and that has caused very high levels of crimes, or the South African public not really trusting their government, because we've seen the police being inactive in our communities, and I think that has caused the current Madlanga Commission. But the Sona response as a resolution into crime, whether it's something that will actually be able to yield any positive results. We may recall that in the past, the soldiers, for instance, have been deployed in various townships of Cape Town, but it is very unclear whether that has been a very social response, because as we know, our issues are interconnected, with the economy of our country that has barely been growing. So these high levels of crime are also largely caused by or associated socioeconomic issues as a country. So by militarizing communities or by putting more soldiers as a response, I think it does not necessarily reforms, but it rather, I think, exacerbates the very violence that communities live under every day because of these issues. And I think, once again, as you say, to protect our democracy, we need to ensure that gang members and all of those who are criminals are not the ones in charge of our country, are not the ones like we've seen in the Madlanga Commission, where we've seen the massive interference with the police work and corruption in the security class of our country. And that makes the South African public lose trust in the state, because it is as though the state is unable to provide protection to the country, of which the state, we know, is in fact constitutionally mandated to do so. Then it erodes our democracy and all of the accountability mechanisms that we have.
Because, Nkanyiso, just to expand on your point, with the deployment of SANDF to assist police, how it was framed as tactical and necessary. But there have been questions about military involvement within cities, what that also means in cities like Johannesburg or Cape Town, when it brings up civil military boundary concerns, how this then also legally interacts with our constitutional rights to dignity, to freedom of movement and safety as well. Why am I also saying this? Because we're looking at the systemic issues as well, also to your point, right, where 5,500 new police officers are also going to be added for more boots on the ground. And whether this actually increases the justice system at large, or if issues like training, community oversight and ethics are still not being adequately addressed as well, because we're trying to balance enforcement, but also addressing the root causes such as poverty, unemployment and inequality at large.
I mean, you're quite correct in pointing that out. You are not addressing the root cause. We are not going at the heart of the issue. We are merely reacting to the crime issue. So the issues with the SANDF intersecting with the police work, we've seen the SANDF, how they tend to behave around communities. During COVID, the violence, because they are not trained to take care of police work. They are trained to be on the battlefield. Yes, we know that they can be deployed in situations where there's a disaster, but the challenge in South Africa, we have so much high levels of police targeting communities and high levels of police brutality, and the lack of accountability mechanisms within the SANDF itself. Would recall that during COVID, there was this case of Khosa and Alexandra. I mean, the family never really got justice because of the lack of justice mechanisms in existence to ensure that there is no violence against civilians. So it is merely a reaction to a very serious crime issue proposed by the president. And I think, as I said earlier, as long as we do not address the socio-economic issues, as long as we do not address other mechanisms like police work that is community-orientated, police work that is going to bring reforms like they've done in Latin America, is to recognize that we must bring more resources to the police, you must pay police well, you must ensure that all of that is addressed holistically in order to be able to respond to crime. But by putting the boots in the streets of SANDF alongside with the SAPS, it does little to resolve crime, as we've seen in the past.
What about, reforms within the criminal justice system at large, where our president did reference using commissions like the Ngqulunga Commission, lifestyle audits, as well to reform the justice system, is going to hold municipal managers to account. But from a legal perspective as well, I mean, what are the limits? What are the strengths of these commissions, these inquiries, versus the rate of criminal prosecution of corruption, given where the system stands?
Yes, because these commissions of inquiry, they merely provide recommendations that are otherwise have no binding nature to the president. So their work is also based on the president's discretion to also take it upon himself that he acts on those recommendations. But the further challenge is that commissions of inquiries would only make a prima facie case, so meaning on the face of it, they would have been able to establish wrongdoing, but that is not sufficient for a criminal prosecution. So it still requires further referral to the National Prosecuting Authority for prosecution, of which sometimes we've seen with the state capture inquiry cases, it has been very difficult to secure those convictions up to so far. So we do need a lot of reforms in our criminal justice systems. I mean, we need bail reforms. We need to rethink some of the laws that we have in place, because we've seen these levels of people re-offending, for instance, after getting bail. And we've seen high levels of violence on GBV, for instance, where the president in his 2024 Sona, he actually had promised that he will build around 12 sexual offences courts, and only 8 that has been built up to so far. It is also a part of that initiative to ensure that there is reforms within the criminal justice system. But there's still a long way to go, because there are quite a number of challenges within the system. There's a lack of resources. Yeah. We've seen that the state has been cutting budgets within these departments, so it is not really easy for them to also execute their task to the fullest and protect the South African public.
And I mean, the youth disproportionately also being affected, given the stats and also the opportunities or lack thereof that's available, whether there's education or, or not. And even if there's the promise to crack down on illicit trade, counterfeit goods as well, because they are hurting jobs and they are hurting the industry at large. These are economic crimes. They have social impacts, though. And I wonder how legal instruments can help, to protect communities and jobs in the ways that ordinary South Africans feel safe. What's that 6 to 12-month timeline from here to that needs to play out for people to perhaps see that the work is being done from your vantage point?
No, thank you for that question. Again, the president had committed to a 3% growth target, of which was a target that we did not meet, unfortunately, last year. And among the issues is that our economy is barely growing in order for it to be able to absorb many young people into formal employment. That's why we have these high levels of unemployment. But secondly, there are other external global factors, such as the tariffs by the Americans, that have also affected quite a lot of our automobile industry, because we are also exporters of a lot of automobile components to the United States and Europe. So, and also those challenges and the lack of industrial policy by the TTIC as a response to how do we diversify our markets and open up for much more newer markets to expand our economy in order to create jobs. That hasn't really been happening. And so the government initiatives, for instance, illicit trade products that are coming into our country, because they do affect the state businesses. Also, those initiatives have not really been coordinated at the government level, because we don't see, like as the president has done, by establishing multi-facet agencies to ensure that there's a directed response to these issues. And we've seen that also with the Chinese companies like Temu and the others that are selling cheap products into South African markets. That does affect South African industries, particularly in the textile industry, because some of the stuff they actually buy online and they employ South Africans. So initiatives affecting young people have not really been directly addressed. I do not feel like.
Well, there's also the creative economy at large. I know there's so much more to unpack. Thank you for your time and for weighing in at this point. Crime, corruption, and state capacity at the center following President Ramaphosa's Sona address. Thank you to lawyer and social activist Nkanyiso Ngqulunga for weighing in at this hour.